Okay, hello, welcome back. This is part two of the introductory lecture. So let's get right to it, and I'll have all of these terms available with definitions in the week one module, so you guys don't have to furiously take notes as I'm moving through them. But these are our key concepts and terms. Like I said, these are the building blocks that we're going to use later when we're actually conducting analysis, when we're actually analyzing the films that we watch. So a lot of these terms are going to be familiar to us, obviously, but I just want us to make sure that we're all kind of working with the same definitions and the same basic understanding. So let's start with director. As you guys notice, the director in this class sort of serves the same function as the author would serve in a traditional literature class. So you'll notice if you're looking in the syllabus, when I'm listing the movies, I have the name of the director beside each movie. So obviously, the director is important. Now, movies are very collaborative, as we know. So there's a lot of people involved in the making of the movie. And if we're thinking about all three stages of film, then obviously there's a whole lot of other people involved with the distribution stage and the exhibition stage. We are going to talk a little bit about those stages, but our focus will mostly stay on production. So that means the director looms very large. So we can define the director as sort of the unifying force behind a film, the one who makes the majority of creative decisions. The majority. Again, there's going to be a lot of other important figures, but the director is generally in charge. And at the very least, the director is collaborating with many others, the screenwriter, the cinematographer, the production designer, maybe the art director, other people as well. But the director is sort of at the top of the pyramid. Now, traditionally, back in the old studio days, a lot of directors were kind of viewed as like guns for hire. They would be brought in by a studio once an idea had already been formulated, a screenplay had already been written, oftentimes, and the director would just come in to kind of more or less kind of mechanically supervise the shooting of the film. And they wouldn't be involved in the writing process. They might not be that deeply involved in the camera work or the sound mixing or set design or any of the other big aspects of film production. And they would just, again, sort of supervise, right? A sort of hired gun that would come in to get the movie made on budget, on schedule, without any complications, because that's often what the studios wanted. But then on the opposite side of the spectrum, we have what's often referred to as the auteur director, right? This is a French term that just means the complete filmmaker, who often will write their own screenplay or at least collaborate with the writer, have some kind of, influence on the screenplay. They'll often sort of carefully supervise every step in the production process. So we think about directors like Ingmar Bergman in this way, or Orson Welles is often thought of in this way, or Quentin Tarantino, Kevin Smith. And again, the sort of rise of the auteur filmmaker kind of begins as part of that new American cinema that we were talking about in part one. At the end of the 60s and into the 70s, you have directors who are increasingly being thought of that way. It's kind of a European concept, but it starts to get applied to a lot of American directors during that era. And since that era is so influential on the later independent filmmakers, again, remember, a lot of those big iconic films in the 70s, they're not independent, right? They were still getting churned out by the studios, but because the industry had opened up, because the studios couldn't control everything anymore, those movies were pushing the envelope. They were innovative. Their style, their visual style, the stories that they were telling, they were cool and different and often weird. So they were a big influence on the later indie filmmakers like Jarmusch, like Smith, who come up in the 80s and 90s. So We still have the term, we still use it, and again, it often applies to directors who write their own scripts, and are very involved with virtually every aspect of production. So, Nicole Holofcener is another one. Holofcener, I think. I'm not sure. Greta Gerwig. Increasingly, and Pearson points this out, a lot of these directors that we're going to be talking about through the 70s, 80s, and 90s are meant. So that's something that we're going to have to wrestle with. We actually only have one female director on our movie list in our syllabus, and that's unfortunate, but we're going to talk about that, and things are changing now to some extent. We're having more and more women directors, and some of them can definitely occupy that auteur sort of designation. So the director's a big deal, and we're going to talk about directors like we typically talk about authors in other English classes. So you always need to be at least familiar with the director of all of these movies. In many cases, the director also writes. We might want to know some of the screenwriters when they are separate from the director. I'm not going to ask you to know the cinematographers and the production designers. I'm really just going to ask you to know the director, a few of the key actors, and maybe a few writers and a few cases. We don't need to worry about producers or all of the other people, the more sort of hands-on, on-set production people. We're not going to know all of them, but of course you can always go to IMDb and grab a few names if you want to talk about camera work. You can always talk specifically about a cinematographer or somebody else. So let's go to screenplay and screenwriter. As we know, pretty much all films start out as scripts or screenplays. Some movies are more about the screenplay than others, right? And Pearson talks about this a little bit, how, some movies, they're sort of literary, right? They're very much based on the character's dialogue, the other things contained within the screenplay, whereas other movies, they have a script, but they have a more visual focus. And the script might not feature quite as much to analyze. But there's always going to be a script or a screenplay that we can think about and talk about. So like I've been saying, some directors write their own screenplays. Others work in concert with the screenwriter and they sort of collaborate. And then other directors aren't really involved in the writing process at all. So it just depends. There have been some famous screenwriters throughout the decades, but typically they end up making their own movies eventually. So you can think about someone like John Milius back in the 70s, who wrote the screenplay for Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. He wrote some other well-regarded screenplays, and then he eventually started making his own movies, writing and directing his own movies in the 80s. He might have even actually started in the 70s. And then there's Paul Schrader, who wrote a lot of Martin Scorsese's screenplays, like for Taxi Driver and maybe Raging Bull. I'm not sure about that one, but he wrote several. And then he eventually became a filmmaker of his own. So that's a common sort of progression. And in contemporary times, we still have some people who kind of became famous as screenwriters, like Charlie Kaufman, who now, again, writes and directs. A really contemporary figure, Taylor Sheridan, you might know him. I think he's responsible for this Yellowstone show that's sweeping the nation. I haven't seen it myself, but I've heard about it. But he wrote the screenplay for Sicario and a few other kind of Western-style kind of action thrillers that were well-regarded. But now I think he's directing. I think he's moving into a more prominent role, but he kind of got a name for himself by writing initially. William Monahan is another one. He worked for Scorsese as well with some more later stuff, but now he directs too. So that's typically what happens. If you get famous as a screenwriter, oftentimes you'll get a chance. It might not always work out, but you might get a chance eventually to direct as well. But some people remain screenwriters forever. That's all they do. So we will talk about screenwriters sometimes. And then let's also think about cinematography. Because again, like I've said, films are obviously visual. It's a visual medium. So we don't have to be experts, and I myself kind of lean a little bit more to the literary, even with movies. So if we're more interested in screenplays and actors' performances and more thematic material, that's fine. But we at least need to be familiar with some basics of camera work, because that always matters when we're watching and analyzing movies, at least a little bit. So cinematography is a general term that basically just refers to the camera work of a movie. So some the cinematographer is in charge of the camera work. Sometimes cinematographers might even operate the camera themselves, but oftentimes they just simply design the shots and sort of supervise. So I want to go through some of the major aspects of cinematography. And again, this is all posted, or it will be posted if you're watching this very early in the week. This stuff will be posted in the week 1 module. So you might want to hang on to this stuff throughout the semester so you can be conversant, so you can talk a little bit about this stuff in some of your later work. So let's start with the idea of point of view. And again, this is kind of a literary concept as well. We can talk about point of view when we're talking about narration, often in fiction, but sometimes in poetry as well, right? There's usually going to be a particular point of view. How is the story presented? Do we have an omniscient third-person narrator who knows everything and is telling us what all the characters think? Or do we have a first-person point of view, a more limited perspective where we're only inside the head of our protagonist? So we always talk about point of view at least a little bit when we're doing literary analysis. So we can also talk about point of view when it comes to the way the camera operates, the way the camera is telling the story in a movie. So with movies, point of view refers to the position from which a person, an event, or an object is filmed. How is it being shown to us? So we can have a subjective point of view or an objective point of view. Generally, a subjective point of view will recreate a particular character or a participant in the action's perspective. So in other words, we will kind of see things from the perspective of a person in the movie. Sometimes it'll be a character, right? If we're seeing another character through this person's eyes, or we're kind of getting the perspective of this character. Other times it'll just kind of be a bystander. Like in the intro to film book that I still have from college, they use some cheesy like sports movie to represent this. Like the subjective point of view is from the catcher, right? Because we can see the pitcher as he winds up and gets ready to throw it, and we're seeing him from the vantage point of the catcher. But the catcher isn't like a main character. It's just a way to see the pitcher, to see that particular shot before the ball is delivered. So sometimes the perspective is a character that we know and can identify with and are familiar with. Other times it's just like a participant in the action. It's just somebody who's there, not even necessarily a main character or a character that we know at all, but we just see something from that perspective, that subjective point of view. But then we have an objective point of view also, which is kind of a more impersonal, from a distance perspective. So it's kind of, some people call it like a godlike perspective. We can see everybody. It doesn't have to be godlike though. It just means that we're not seeing it from a person's perspective. We're kind of getting more of a bird's eye view, or just a sort of a wider perspective that includes maybe more people. It might be kind of like we're above them, or we're standing at a relative distance from them, and we can kind of see it all. So those are kind of the two basic styles of point of view that we can see in a movie. Now, let's talk about the four major attributes of the camera shot. So just like with literary analysis, we have to talk about individual words, individual sentences. Sometimes if you guys took my 451, you know that I like you to close read. I like you to grab a very small passage and tell me what that word means. Break down that imagery, that particular metaphor. Let's get granular and let's talk about some of the individual units, words, sentences, paragraphs that go into the larger text, that make up the larger text. Well, when we do that same kind of work with movies, we really have to sometimes think about camera shots. We can also work with dialogue. Again, going back to the screenplay, we can definitely work with dialogue, lines, things that people are saying, and we can do literary analysis just like we've done before. But we also want to think about camera shots as being a basic unit of the film. And sometimes we want to think a little bit more about individual camera shots. So just to have a quick definition of a camera shot, it's just a series of frames that runs for an uninterrupted period of time. So in other words, it's the point from which the camera rolls until it stops. Right? And then later it's going to be separated. These shots will be separated by cuts during the editing process. So as you start watching movies in this class, or if you're just watching something for fun, some weekend, pay attention to the duration and the nature of individual shots. Now, in most modern movies, individual shots are very, very short. They might run for just, oftentimes like 3 seconds, 5 seconds, maybe between 5 and 10 seconds, but that's kind of rare. If you're watching more art house fare, if you're watching art house cinema, sometimes more independent cinema, you will get longer shots. I think you're going to notice with Jarmusch that he has some long shots and he has a relative lack of camera movement. In Stranger Than Paradise, that's kind of his signature style at the beginning of his career. Now, his style has evolved and changed a bit. He's still making movies today. I think he's grown a lot visually. But again, we'll talk more about Jarmusch later, but his background is kind of more in literature, writing. And his early movies are a bit primitive in some ways. And if you read the little dialogue sections, primitive visually, I mean. But they have a certain aesthetic that works. But if you read those dialogue sections in Pearson's book where he's talking to Kevin Smith, some of you might know Smith, we're going to watch Clerks later this semester, but Smith specifically says, when I watched Jarmusch, I was like, oh, I can do that. Like, that's a visual style that I can emulate. And he does. In his early movies, he too has evolved as his career's gone on. But you'll notice that with a lot of modern films, and certainly Hollywood films, like big budget, action movies, the cuts are rapid. The individual camera shots are very, very short. So just pay a little bit of attention to that. But when we're looking at individual shots, there are kind of 4 major attributes that we can think about. And I'll just try to keep this brief. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds. But again, use these definitions, and you can always look up some additional info because there's a ton of stuff online. There's a lot of books available, websites. You can get more in depth with some of this stuff if you want to, but I just want you to have a basic understanding. So let's go through the 4 major attributes. Number 1, framing. Each shot in a movie is carefully constructed and framed by the cinematographer. And sometimes the director might be involved in this. Sometimes, the camera operator will have a say. But this is the cinematographer's area, right? The cinematographer is generally in charge of all of these attributes. So think about framing. The framing of a shot basically limits or sort of directs the point of view within the borders of that rectangular sort of frame that we're looking at when we look at a screen, right? So the height and the width of the frame does kind of matter when we're thinking about the size, the distance, or the angle of the camera shot that we're seeing. So within the general heading of framing, we can basically think about the most basic sort of popular camera shots that sort of exist. The shots and angles that we're all familiar with just from watching movies or TV shows, even if we don't know the terms, right? So if we're thinking about stuff like close-ups, extreme close-ups, a medium close-up. There's a lot of little variations. A medium close-up would usually be the subject's like shoulders and head. Then we also have the long shot, where we're seeing things at a pretty extreme distance. A medium shot, that's typically going to be like from the waist or the hips up. Not seeing the entire person's body, but maybe seeing most of the body. So we're kind of already familiar. These are, again, sort of the basic units that are used in virtually any movie, regardless of the genre or, the subject matter. We're going to see these kinds of shots. Now, some directors like close-ups more than others. Some cinematographers like close-ups or extreme close-ups more than others. Some kind of use them sparingly. Others are going to get really tight on people's faces. But long shots, medium shots, everybody uses those. It doesn't even really matter what your style is. Everybody uses these basic kinds of camera angles. And also, we can think about sort of high camera angles, overhead shots, right? Where we're looking down on the action. Those are pretty familiar, pretty common. Those are like crane shots, or again, sometimes they'll get up in a helicopter if we're getting a look at the city or something. So we're often overhead, looking down. So that's a high angle, right? A high camera angle. We're high, we're looking down. And then a low angle, we're kind of beneath the action, looking up at it. Right? And then we also have POV shots, right? Point of view shots, again, very subjective shots where we are seeing things from the perspective of a character, right? It's like recreating the perspective of a character or a participant in the action. Okay, so that all falls under framing. So framing is our first major attribute of the camera shot. The second major attribute is depth of field. So shots can be created at different depths, and that can subtly shape our understanding of the action, our understanding of what we are seeing. So some shots are going to be in deep focus, which means that multiple planes in the image are all in focus. Okay, so that kind of gives us a wider perspective, maybe more visibility. And then we can also have shots that are in shallow focus, where only a narrow range of the field is in focus. And then we can also have rack focus, sometimes called pulled focus. And that's where the focus shifts rapidly from one object to another. And that is usually significant. I don't know if any of you guys watch a lot of TV, but there's this commercial. I'm a bit of a sports fan, so I watch sports on TV, and there's this commercial that plays, I don't know, every 10 minutes or so. It seems like. I can't even remember the product. I think it's a phone, maybe. I think it's like some phone brand, but it is kind of funny, and it's a good way to think about focus. It's kind of spoofing a sort of detective or action movie. So you have these two cops sitting in a car, and one guy is in focus. The guy closest to the camera is in focus. He's in the driver's seat. And then the guy sitting in the passenger seat is blurry. He's not in focus. So we get a shallow field in this one, right? This is more of a shallow focus. Only a certain part of our field of vision is in focus. And the blurry guy asks the other guy, he's like, I'm blurry. Why am I blurry? And then the lead guy, who's obviously the star, the guy who's in focus, he says, because you're a supporting character. The focus is bringing attention to the most important character in the scene, which is me. And that's kind of funny, but then the focus shifts and the guy in the passenger seat becomes in focus and the guy in the driver's seat becomes blurry. And then the passenger seat guy is like, oh, now I'm in focus. I guess that means I'm the most important character in this scene. And then the lead guy is like, no, you're not. And that's the end of the commercial. But that is a helpful illustration as to how focus can tell us, the audience, what we're supposed to be paying attention to. What's the most important thing? What can we see clearly? The blurry stuff, that's background, that's supporting stuff, that's not as important. So the focus attracts our attention and tells us what to focus on, clearly. So that is important to consider. You don't have to get as in-depth as I just did with the commercial, but it is something to think about. So that's the second attribute. The third attribute is contrast and color. So mostly thinking about color. We don't think about this as much anymore because most movies are in color. But of course, for a long time, they were in black and white. And some movies, even today, are still in black and white. That's like a stylistic choice that some directors and cinematographers will make for various reasons. But you should notice that color matters, right? So anytime we're thinking about shooting locations or set decorations or, actors' costumes, that all constitutes what we can think of as the spectrum of color in any particular movie. Right? There's always different colors, and different colors have different connotations, and they might serve kind of symbolic functions that we can always analyze. Just like if colors show up in literature, we can often analyze them because they usually mean something. And we can also think a little bit about the tone, color tone, which refers to like shading or the intensification or the saturation that can sometimes be used in a movie to either sharpen colors, to mute colors, or to balance colors. And again, as we know, certain colors or certain tones can have a big impact on the emotional response of the audience. So I actually saw an article just the other day about the prevalence of kind of washed out tones. How so many movies, especially like kind of dystopian kind of, future-looking movies have this kind of washed-out gray tone, not a lot of vibrant colors. And again, that kind of puts us in a certain mood, doesn't it? That makes us feel a certain way when we see a lot of grays and kind of muted colors. It might depress us. It might make us understand that there's sort of depredation and, bad things happening or people are unhappy. But sometimes vivid colors can lighten the mood, but they can also sometimes be so intense and there can be such a sharp contrast created that, again, it might be jarring, it might be disturbing, and maybe it's supposed to be. So, again, we don't have to think too much beyond that, but just keep in mind, again, this is something you can delve into more if you want. But color and tone are often influenced by film stock. Again, stuff that's being selected by directors and cinematographers. And now, people talk about this, film scholars talk about this. Now, as we have increasingly digital film productions, some people have even made movies on their iPhones. That creates a different color spectrum in a lot of ways. That affects color. Traditionally, the old kind of film stock that would have been used, and there's different kinds, but kind of old, like traditional movie making kind of has different colors in some cases compared to stuff that's being made digitally or a lot of more recent film, which just frankly looks different. And we can also think about lighting. Lighting is kind of its own thing, but during production, it often falls under the supervision of the cinematographer. On set, the head lighter guy is usually called the gaffer or the head electrical technician. and they have their own crew and they're responsible for setting up the lighting. But again, because it has such a big impact on camera shots and the presentation of the action, the cinematographer usually has a hand in directing the lighting and making sure the lighting is achieving what they want in terms of color, in terms of what we see on screen. All right, so the fourth and final attribute is the one that I think we probably talk about the most, along with individual camera shots and angles, which again fall under framing. We can also talk about camera movement. So movement is the fourth attribute, and this is just very noticeable. If you're really paying attention, you can notice the way the camera moves. This does not take a lot of specialized knowledge. It just takes a careful eye. So this is how the movement is how the camera recreates regular human movement. Again, to kind of create a sensation of being there, or to create maybe more of a realistic perspective. So the main kinds of movements that we're thinking about first will be pans and tilts. And again, we've noticed these even if we don't know or didn't know what they're called. So a pan is when you're kind of moving the camera from side to side. It simulates the action of a person sort of turning their head. Okay, so the camera remains stationary on its mount. But you're sort of moving it on this, I guess it would be a horizontal axis, right? You're moving it from side to side in order to capture people perhaps moving, or to get a more panoramic. Pan is short for panoramic. So you're getting a more sort of complete portrait, going from side to side to see a meadow or a mountain range or somebody's house or maybe a street scene. You'll often see pans, okay? And then you also have tilts, right? So tilts are simulating looking up and down. So now we're kind of moving the camera on a vertical axis, right? Again, the camera itself is not moving. If it's on a tripod or a mount, you can simply tilt it up or tilt it down to simulate looking up or looking down. So you're going to notice those if you're paying close attention to any movie. And then we also have tracking shots, which are fun. I like to look at these oftentimes because with a tracking shot, that really simulates movement. Now we're usually following the subject or some character in the film. We're following somebody forward or backward, and this creates the sensation of movement because the camera is moving now, usually on a wheeled dolly. So again, the camera operator is usually up there, and a couple of the grips are pushing the dolly. Now they probably have more technology for that. Maybe they can just put it on a track or something. But the camera is literally following a subject forward or backward. So sometimes we talk about like steady cam shots. Or sometimes they call these dolly shots. There's that with a steady cam, it's a little bit different. I think it's the same idea. One of the most famous steady cam shots, if you've ever seen Goodfellas, and I'll try to post. I've provided a few examples of the different shots and some of these different movements. I'll try to add a few more to the week 1 module so we have this glossary with examples for the rest of the semester. But in that famous scene in the nightclub in Goodfellas when Henry Hill is leading Lorraine Bracco through the back entrance to whatever nightclub they're in New York City, that's a steady cam shot. But we can just classify it as a tracking shot because we are following them as they make their way through these winding hallways, through the kitchen, and then they eventually arrive at their table. And Henry, of course, is handing out $20 bills to everybody because everybody knows him, and he's a big shot. He's obviously the big gangster, and his girlfriend is starting to learn that he's a gangster. That's the thematic importance of the scene, but it's just a virtuoso scene. It's Scorsese, of course, and generally tracking shots last a pretty long time. They're usually going to be continuous, unbroken, and they're hard to pull off, right? Versus a typical camera shot, if you're just doing a close-up for a few seconds, okay, that's pretty easy to capture as long as the actor reads the line right and does the right stuff. But a tracking shot is typically going to be longer. There's more moving pieces, and they're usually impressive and fun to watch. And then finally, the only other movement that we really need to worry about will be the zoom, right? And again, this is easy to see. Sometimes we zoom in and get closer to the subject on screen, and then sometimes we zoom out and get further away. That's an easy movement to track and analyze. So you can think about zooming in or zooming out. Okay, so that's enough on cinematography. Let's move on. And this next one is important. It can be a little bit tricky, this next term, but hopefully I can make sense of it. It's a French term that I often have trouble pronouncing, mise en scene. Mise en scene. This is a French term that means placement in scene. And it encompasses everything that is visible on screen. All the scenic elements consisting of actors, aspects of lighting, the setting, the sets, costumes, makeup, everything else that we see that exists independently of the camera and the editing process. So this is the important distinction that I want you to understand. We just talked about camera stuff for a long time, right? But mise en scene is different. Like, it's still the stuff that we're seeing, right? But it's stuff that exists independently of the camera. So even before the camera starts rolling, all of this stuff, all of the stuff that gets encompassed under mise en scene is already there. Like, it's already been made, it's already been sort of devised, created, and the camera is just capturing it, right? So there's a lot that goes into mise en scene. Typically, when we think about it, we're thinking primarily about set design. And that's fine. I want you to think about set design. What does the set look like? What are the objects contained within that set? There's a lot to do with sets, and there's a lot that goes into the creation of sets that we just don't have time for. But we can always analyze sets. We can always look at what's there in the scene. What's there? What's present? The furniture, the objects. If we're inside, again, we're going to be looking at stuff that we might typically find in an apartment or a house. If we're outside, we're looking at, people passing by. We're looking at cars, buildings. Maybe we're in nature. What's there? How does it look? That's always very intentional. It's always very deliberate in the making of a movie. So set design is always worth considering, and typically set design falls under the supervision of what we call the production designer, sometimes called the production manager. This person is largely in charge of a lot of the aspects of mise en scene. Okay, and then under the production designer, you normally have an art department. And the art department consists of a lot of people. Again, movies are supremely collaborative, and we don't need to know all of those individual people. But the art department is responsible for actually constructing the sets, arranging props, and just basically creating the overall on-screen appearance that we're all going to notice. Now, back in the old days, the old Hollywood days, like I said, most movies were shot on Hollywood backlots. They were they were not filmed on location. Typically, there were exceptions, and they could always get some second unit stuff, go out in the city, get some of those overhead shots, get some long shots that they can use to help create setting. But most of the scenes would be shot in Burbank, on the Paramount lot. But nowadays, we do have a lot more on-location shooting, and we have a lot more natural locations, natural settings. But they still have to be managed. They still have to be arranged. The production designer and the art department, they're still very much involved, no matter what kind of shooting location, no matter what kind of setting we're looking at. So falling under the general heading of mise-en-scene, we can think about lighting. Again, lighting sometimes gets classified as part of cinematography, but we can also kind of consider it as just part of the overall visual experience that we're getting. And it does kind of exist independently of the camera. So we can think about it. We can think about costumes. We can think about makeup and hair, and the makeup and hair of the actors on screen, the costumes of the actors. And then obviously we can also think about the actors themselves, how they look, how they move, how they sound. All of that's part of mise-en-scene. And we can even think about blocking. That's a specific term that refers to the arrangement and movement of actors in an individual scene. Again, that's all planned out. That's not random, right? Actors is kind of, if some of you might be, experienced or familiar with stage plays, right? So I think blocking is somewhat similar on stage. Not the exact same, I'm sure, but you have to move in certain ways, right? Like, it's all choreographed. It's all carefully managed. Some people are going to stand over here, and then this guy's going to walk here, and then she's going to get up from the chair, but he can't stand in a way that he's in blocking the view of her, right? So he has to stand here. She has to walk there. So that's blocking. That's the arrangement of the actors and their movement. And that's a big part of mise-en-scene, and that's something you can also analyze within an individual scene. Okay, we're almost there. The final bit, there's two more categories that I just want to share with you briefly. We don't have to say a whole lot about them. Acting, and then finally editing. Two other things that we can look for, think about, and analyze. Obviously, if we're going to talk about movies, we have to talk about actors. But you don't need much instruction from me when dealing with this element. We can form our own opinions, and we should form our own opinions concerning the performances of individual actors. And I do want to make an important distinction, and I want us to use this language. It's a little arbitrary, and it's a little bit simplistic, perhaps, but I think it'll be useful. We should distinguish, when we're talking about actors, we should distinguish between movie stars and what we often call character actors. So movie stars, as we know, these are the leading actors. These are the stars of the individual movies. And with big budget, Hollywood movies, obviously, these are celebrities, right? These are the people that are on, People magazines, like 50 most beautiful people in the world or whatever. These are celebrities. These are the people going on talk shows. Their love lives get talked about online. We know these people, right? We know movie stars, and they are typically the leads. They are typically the featured sort of attraction within the movie. So they are celebrities. They are usually extraordinarily beautiful. And of course, they're very famous. Then we have character actors. Now, sometimes a character actor might eventually become a movie star, but typically these categories are a little bit separate. So a character actor will often appear in secondary roles, important roles. But sometimes, again, they might be a little out of focus at times because they might be supporting cast, right? But they're still playing important roles. They might be the villain. They might be the sidekick, you know. They might not. They're not the stars, but they're playing important supporting roles or secondary roles within the film. They might be the comic relief. Again, they're often thought of as maybe having more acting chops than a lot of the stars, right? Because they might have a little bit more range. A character actor might be a villain in one movie, and then he might be the funny partner of the detective played by Chris Hemsworth or whatever in another movie. So he can do different stuff, right? He can be funny, he can be scary, he can be a criminal, he can be a cop, you know, whatever you want. So these types of actors can frequently become pretty famous. They're often very recognizable, right? There's the old joke about, oh, I don't know his name, but I've seen him in a million movies. I mean, that's kind of your typical character actor. But if you're a character actor long enough in enough beloved films, you can become a star. Even if you're not sort of as traditionally beautiful, even if you don't start out as a movie star. The example I use is Steve Buscemi, right? He was a character actor for a really long time. But now, I mean, he was the star of Boardwalk Empire, a pretty famous movie. A pretty famous TV show, I should say. I guess in movies, he still does typically play supporting roles. So I don't know that he's fully graduated to movie star level, but he's famous, right? I mean, most people know who he is. So character actors can take a path to fame, but they're typically supporting roles. So we should distinguish between those two. And then we also have extras, you know, people who we just kind of see in the background passing by or maybe in large crowd scenes. So we can be specific when we're talking about particular actors in particular roles. And just a final thing, if we are going to analyze individual actors' performances, we might think about sort of the difference between the actors who are known for really like getting into character. Sometimes we refer to these actors as method actors. That's kind of a loose term. It kind of came into prominence back in the 50s and 60s with guys like James Dean and Marlon Brando. And nowadays we think of like Daniel Day-Lewis kind of in this way where they inhabit the character, right? Some of these guys like Daniel Day-Lewis notoriously will stay in character for much of the principal photography, much of the shoot. So you have to refer to him by his character's name, and he acts like his character, you know, throughout the entire shooting. And of course, movies can take months, months and months to get, you know, the production stage can take months. Now, I think some of those stories probably get overblown, but I think there is some truth to it. So we can think about actors who have that technique of really getting into the character. And again, they're kind of chameleons, right? Again, using the example of Daniel Day-Lewis, he's played a lot of different kinds of characters. He's definitely a movie star. I think he's retired now. We'll see how long that lasts, but he's definitely a movie star. But he's a movie star who many people acknowledge as sort of a great artist, you know, a truly talented, gifted, versatile actor who can play a lot of different kinds of roles. Not all movie stars are thought of that way, fair or not. But then we also have actors, again, these tend to be stars who they're not method, right? And they don't really have the same range, perhaps. They don't have the ability to play quite as many different parts. We might think of them as just sort of riffing on their public persona, or they're good at playing certain types. You know, I think of like Bruce Willis this way. Like, I think Bruce Willis is a good actor, but he's good as certain types of people. He's the cop, or now he's like the gruff dad, you know, he's pretty old now. And, you know, he's done some other stuff, but that's kind of how we think of him. Or maybe, again, Chris Hemsworth. But sometimes we can change the narrative, right? I think Brad Pitt was thought of in that way for a long time. Like, oh, he can only do certain roles. He's the hero, you know, he's the dashing, good-looking guy. But, I mean, he has done some different stuff. in recent years. So we sometimes revise our opinions about these actors, and that's always something we can talk about. Hey, this actor is playing against type. This isn't where we normally see this actor. That's always fun to explore. Another thing that we can analyze. And then finally, the last big element that I want to share with you is editing. We're not going to talk a whole lot about post-production. Again, if we're thinking about production in a little bit more of a full sense, we can think about pre-production, the production itself, the principal photography, and then post-production. That means editing. That means special effects or the other computer kind of graphics that might go into the movie. A lot of the sound mixing, a lot of the stuff involving the soundtrack, and of course we can talk about music. I'll throw music in there as kind of an honorary element. I'm not going to talk about it at length, but I'll have it on the list. You can always talk about the soundtrack. You can always talk about the music we hear in the movie. And there's also a difference between music that's played within the diegesis of the movie, within the fictive world of the movie, versus stuff that might just be played kind of for the audience. And we can dive into that a little bit later, perhaps, if we want to. So a lot of that gets done at the post-production level. So, we don't have to get too deep into it, but just be aware of editing. That is the process by which different images or shots are linked together during the post-production process. So there's been a lot of different editing styles over the years. Soviet montage back in the early 20th century was kind of influential on a lot of early American filmmakers. That's just juxtaposing sort of disparate shots very rapidly. And, we still see elements of that in movies now to kind of create a certain effect, a certain emotional response. There's also the concept of jump cuts. This was kind of popularized by some French directors during the French New Wave, and a lot of that was like 60s. A lot of American indie filmmakers were very influenced by the French New Wave, by directors like Truffaut, Godard, I don't know how to say it, but all those French guys. And they use jump cuts oftentimes, which are just edits that create gaps in the action. See, in the old Hollywood traditional style, you would never want jump cuts. That was thought of as sloppy, right? They wanted continuity in the old days, right? So if you have a shot of me talking to somebody, right, you're going to cut to me doing the next thing that I would be naturally doing, right? Turning, walking away, sitting back down. But with the jump cut, you might go from me talking to that person to me in the car, right? Now I'm doing something different, right? If you've ever seen Breathless by Godard, that's kind of a famous, that's a movie that kind of helped popularize the jump cut. And it's done for stylistic reasons. It's kind of fun, and it moves us ahead in the action. But the old editors from the golden age of Hollywood were probably horrified when they saw that, because they were like, you can't do that. But now you can, and people do. And you guys know, if you watch modern movies, the predominant editing style nowadays is very fast-paced, right? Like I said, rapid cuts. Camera shots are not long. We're not lingering on them for long. We're cutting from one thing to the next very rapidly. And a lot of scholars will point to the influence of commercials and music videos in the 80s, as kind of helping to change movie editing. Because people have shorter attention spans now. I hear it all the time. Anytime, I try to get people to watch old movies, that it is a complaint, right? They're slower paced. The editing is slower. The shots tend to be a little bit longer. And, it's just something that we can notice. It's something that we can analyze. Okay, one final thought, and then we'll sign off here, and we'll come back later this week for Jarmusch and Stranger Than Paradise. But just while I'm thinking about that movie, again, think about camera movement with that movie. Another thing we're going to talk about, I kind of forgot to mention it in my movement summary, but there's a lot more handheld camera work nowadays in modern films, right? Traditionally, you'd want your camera to be mounted. You'd want it to be stationary. Again, you can pan, you can tilt, you can put it on the dolly for a tracking shot. But now we have a lot more handheld stuff. Little shakier, right? Again, simulating movement in maybe an even more realistic way. But notice the movement or the lack of movement in Jarmusch. Notice his style, his visual style, and think about those 4 attributes of cinematography. We can also think about editing as you're watching. But of course, think about it all. Think about all of it. But definitely think about movement. Think about his visual style and how it might be different. Or maybe in some ways the same, but different often from maybe more mainstream, popular, contemporary films. Okay, final thing, let's just be aware of the difference between scenes and sequences. Again, if we're doing analysis, we need to be able to tackle individual scenes and in some cases individual sequences. Because again, you guys know this. If you're analyzing a novel, and you're writing a paper about it for your English class, you can't really talk about the entire novel. There's a lot in there. There's a lot going on. So typically we're going to pick out individual scenes. Again, scenes exist, in movies and in films. Like we said, a lot of these elements have crossover. When you're talking about actors, you're talking about characters, right? When you're talking about set design, you're talking about setting. So a lot of these elements cross over, but it's just maybe the language changes a little bit. And that's also true with scenes. A scene in a novel functions in a very similar way to a scene in a movie. But here's a definition that we can work with for scene. A scene is one or more shots that show continuous space, time, and action. Okay, so it's going to be sort of a coherent event, one coherent, unified event or action, right? Where we pretty much stay in the same place. It's for a relatively short period of time, and it kind of represents or depicts one unified action. Okay, that's typically a scene. So scenes don't usually last very long. I mean, they're going to vary, right? But a scene might be me and a bunch of people sitting around in a house talking. We're having a particular conversation, right, about a particular thing. We're in a particular place. There's 4 of us. We're talking. Exposition, dialogue, talking. And then the scene ends and the next scene begins and we're somewhere else, or we're doing something else, or in some ways the scene has shifted, right? The action has changed. The location, perhaps, has changed, right? So we can identify individual scenes, and certainly we can analyze them. That's kind of like close reading. With a work of literature, we grab a paragraph or we grab one scene that might take place over a page or 2, and we can just analyze that for a little while. We can do the same with scenes in movies. And then a sequence is typically going to be a collection of shots or a collection of scenes, right, that are, again, unified or coherent, even though we might change locations and the action might shift a little bit. So maybe me and those guys were planning a robbery, right? So the sequence is going to consist of a little bit of planning, us driving to the bank, and then robbing it. That's just one part of the movie. It's kind of like if you've seen Reservoir Dogs, right? Like the actual robbery stuff, that's an early sequence that actually doesn't take a lot of running time. We never actually see the robbery. We're going to watch a different Tarantino film. But a sequence is kind of this coherent, unified series of things that are all linked, all sort of related, but we might change location and we might see a few different things. We're in the house, we're driving, then we get to the bank, we rob it. That's the robbery sequence, right? We can talk about that. And then after the robbery, we're doing different stuff, right? Different focus. So we can talk about individual scenes And then we can also talk about individual sequences. Sequences are usually going to be comprised of a handful of scenes, right? So we can get really micro with individual scenes, even with individual lines of dialogue or particular colors or camera movements within that scene. And then we can get a little more macro by thinking about entire sequences. We can think about them thematically. We can think about them visually. We can really do any number of things. That's what makes film analysis so fun. Okay, so I'm exhausted. I'm sure we all are. That's it for week one, for the introductory lecture in week one. Our real, normal, regular week one lecture will come later. We'll talk about Jarmusch and Stranger Than Paradise. Okay, see you then.